Hello, everyone, and welcome to the March 2025 episode of Diabetes Care on Air, a fun way to bring the research in diabetes care to life. I'm Alice Cheng from the University of Toronto.
And I'm Mike Rickles from the University of Pennsylvania, and we are your co-hosts for this podcast series.
Well, welcome, everyone, to the beautiful month of March. It represents the beginning of spring for us in the Northern Hemisphere and the beginning of fall for those in the Southern Hemisphere. Also, this month marks the beginning of the holy month of Ramadan. And speaking of Ramadan, I want to remind our listeners about Diabetes and Ramadan practical guidelines that were developed by the Diabetes and Ramadan International Alliance in collaboration with the International Diabetes Federation. There are online resources and a couple of excellent apps, one for healthcare providers called DAR Academy and another for patients called DAR Safa. Check them out.
Thanks, Alice. Very useful resources to be aware of. I would also direct people to Chapter 5 of the 2025 American Diabetes Association's Standards of Care document that discusses religious fasting and specifically recommends the use of the document you mentioned, Alice, to help people living with diabetes minimize risk if they choose to fast.
Now, after discussing those important facts about March, I have to end off with a fun fact that, frankly, I think speaks to the priorities of the general public and not necessarily in a good way. Now, did you know that statistically, March is the most unproductive month of the year in the United States? Now, why, you ask? Well, because of March Madness, which is the annual NCAA college basketball tournament. True or not, it is a fun nugget.
Well, that is news to me, Alice. I might have thought it was spring skiing, but that might just be what I'd hope to be unproductive for this month. Well, let's kick off our March 2025 episode. As per usual, we will be each interviewing authors of feature articles as selected by the editors of Diabetes Care.
And we will end things off with our popular Rapid Exchange segment, where we discuss some of the articles we found particularly interesting. Let's get started.
In the March 2025 issue of Diabetes Care is a feature article entitled Financial Incentives, Income Supplementation, Cash Transfer, and Universal Basic Income Interventions in Diabetes. Understanding Differences and Effectiveness, a Scoping Review. I'm delighted to welcome the article's first author, Dr. Leonard Egeda. Dr. Egeda is the Charles and Mary Bauer Professor of Medicine and Chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of Buffalo Jacobs School of Medicine and Biomedical Sciences in Buffalo, New York. Leonard, I'm so glad you could join us.
Oh, thank you. Really glad to be here.
First, congratulations to you, Leonard, and your co-authors on your feature article. Since we will be discussing incentives, and as you're a leading investigator conducting health disparities research, I was hoping you could tell us a little about your motivation to conduct this scoping review of monetary intervention approaches for diabetes care.
Yeah, so this is something that my group has been grappling with for a while now because we found that when we tried to justify incentive payments for studies, there was really nothing in the literature that really separated the different components. Even as far as study sections, we get people asking questions about how is this different from incentives? What's the difference between cash transfers? And so we sat down and we said, well, we need to come up with some kind of framework. It was even more important because of the work around equity and how a lot of focus now on trying to do some kind of supplementation of income to address health inequalities. And so we sat down and it was a group of us, myself as a clinician, health services researchers, we had an economist, and we sat down and we said, well, what do we do about this and how do we address this issue? And that's how we came up with the idea of this scoping review.
And Leonard, your article discusses several of the different approaches for monetary intervention. Can you briefly explain and provide an example of each type?
So what we realized, and I'm just going to summarize, what we realized was that people conflate a lot of these terms because at the end of the day, you're giving money. But yet, from a theoretical standpoint, they are very different. So what we did was to break them down into 4 categories. So the very first category is the concept of financial incentives. And financial incentives are essentially schemes that vary depending on the behavior that is targeted. But most financial incentives are designed to shape certain behaviors. And when we look at the literature, the typical amount of money that is spent for incentives go from a few dollars a month to about $125 a month. That's about the upper limit. And most of them are not designed to supplement income. They are really designed to really motivate or change behavior. Then the second component is income supplementation. And this is where things begin to get more difficult, because when we use the word income supplementation, the intent is that it has to supplement income, which means that it's meant for individuals who are lower income, where income supplementation may be helpful. And when we look at the literature, there was really nothing there that helped clarify this. So we came up with a working definition where we actually defined income supplementation as provision of minimal monetary support through cash, vouchers, and or coupons for the purpose of supplementing earned income. And so we then looked at the literature, and typical things we've seen there, it ranges from about $100 a month to about $250 a month. The third component is cash transfers, and this is becoming more popular now, or more common, especially in international settings. And so the cash transfers are where people are giving money, but the difference is that with cash transfers, usually the amounts are a little bit higher, and there's 2 components. It's called conditional or unconditional. Conditional is when it's conditional on a certain behavior. So you're giving money for people to change certain behaviors. Again, it's usually given to individuals who are lower income, and you're actually giving them some resources. Then unconditional is when the money doesn't have conditions attached to it. So you give the funds, and the individual can spend it in whatever way they want. And so again, typical cash transfers range from about $300 a month to about $1,000 a month. They are guaranteed, and they are designed to supplement income. Whereas the fourth component is universal basic income, which is defined as financial support provided by a governmental entity in the form of standard recurring payments to all individuals without the need for pre-qualification. So the difference here is that unlike cash transfers, it's not income-based. You don't have to provide means-based testing. And what we found is, and this happens in Europe, and it's beginning to happen in some states in the US, and the general range is anywhere from about $1,000 to about $1,500. So we felt like with these 4 different groups of types of monetary interventions, it was important to actually clarify, define them, and really allow people who are working in the field to use the same consistent language as they actually describe the interventions.
Yeah, and that is super helpful then, because you want to be sure you're comparing apples to apples in terms of what approaches are effective, what approaches might not be effective, and under what circumstances and conditions one may be preferentially applied over another. Leonard, your article also discusses the behavioral economic theory underpinning the use of financial incentives, and I'm hoping you can explain a little bit about this concept of using short-term benefits to affect future cost-benefit considerations for our patients.
Yeah, so I think what is becoming very clear now, people are using behavioral economics theory to guide incentives. So there are 2 components to financial incentives. There's financial incentives, and there are financial disincentives. And the idea is that the underlying theory is that, in traditional economic theory, people are rational and they act rationally. So they respond rationally to certain incentives. Whereas with behavioral economics, it's becoming very clear that it's not as rational as people would actually imagine. And so the idea that people make the concept of discounting future benefit, that some people are more focused on the benefit of the here and now versus the future benefit. So you can imagine in diabetes, we are telling people to change behavior that will benefit them 10 years from now. And so for those individuals, the question is, that's value orientation, the future orientation, and that drives certain behaviors. And so the idea of incentives is that if you could actually use incentives to do what we call extrinsic motivation, so it's an extrinsic motivator, enough for people to then switch to intrinsic motivation, that you can actually get people to tide over until they get to the point where they've actually seen true benefit from the behavior change, and then it becomes part of who they are and what they do going forward.
So it helps give a jump start to making those changes that we're all talking about and know are so important for long-term outcomes. And so what did your review find in terms of the evidence for the effect of various monetary interventions on health-related outcomes in diabetes?
Yeah, so what we did was we actually defined outcomes using the ABCs of diabetes, A1C, blood pressure, cholesterol. We also looked at quality of life, and then we looked at some psychosocial factors and then certain self-care behaviors. And what we found was a total of 13 articles that met our inclusion criteria that we included in the final analysis. And across all these 13 studies, 8 used financial incentives, 3 used money, 3 used a form of income supplementation, and 1 used cash transfer, and then 1 used a combination of income supplementation and financial incentives. 10 of the 13 studies found statistically significant, clinically meaningful changes in A1C. And then what we found was the average change in A1C ranged from about 0.2% difference to about almost 2% difference. And so you could see that these interventions potentially have some significant benefit. And then when we looked for income supplementation, we found anywhere from 0.7% to 1.3% benefit. And then for cash transfers, we found about 0.2 to 0.7%. So these are meaningful differences in glycemic control, A1C, which you tend to approximate what you see with medication. So it was really significant findings.
And Leonard, what were the strategies that were used for successful interventions? How are these actually employed to make a change or a difference and qualify for the transfer? What's the best approach for conducting this?
Yeah, so we have a couple of funded investigations, NIH funded grants that are actually looking at this. So we have one that's a financial incentives grant where we're actually giving people incentives based on behavior change. And we give a portion of the incentives to if they actually attend education classes, so telephone education classes, a portion of incentives if they actually bring their average glucose down to a certain level, and a third component if they drop A1Cs at 3 months. And so that's the study we've been following. It's an NIH funded grant, it's 12 months. And then the idea was at the end of 12 months, we'll stop the incentives and we'll follow them for the additional 6 months to see if the incentives, if they had actually switched from extrinsic to intrinsic motivation. So that study is just finishing up and we're going to see. But what we found is that for all our studies, we tend to have a baseline of diabetes education because it doesn't matter how much money you give to people, they need to know what to do and how to manage their diabetes. So that's that component. Then one of my mentees is actually working on just completed a cash transfer intervention where we give participants, low income, Medicaid eligible individuals, we give them $500 a month, and half of them got what we call conditional. So they had to attend 2 education classes a month, and the other group got unconditional, which was we just give them the money and we said, here's education about diabetes material, and then just do that. We followed them for 6 months. And what we found is that both groups dropped A1Cs by anywhere from 0.6 to 0.9. So again, we always add diabetes education as foundational to that. And sometimes we'll add coaching by a certified diabetes educator or a nurse to actually provide coaching. But the key element is that the incentives plus some kind of education is really critical.
That's wonderful, Leonard. And finally, what other takeaway messages do you have for our listeners?
I think what we are beginning to recognize is, and this goes to the issue of equity, right? That at a certain income level, it's very difficult to manage diabetes. If you think about the cost of test strips, the cost of medications, even when you have insurance, the co-pays get to be expensive. So the more we're able to explore these types of monetary interventions that seem to work, but also offset some of the pressures of managing diabetes, I think it will actually help us. We are very focused now on the concept of medical social integration, which is the idea that individuals do not have medical conditions, they live in communities, and that the community actually impacts them. And some of these social challenges are key reasons why we don't achieve the control that we actually expect in a population as affluent as the United States. So we are hoping that as we begin to pay attention to some of these social drivers of care and we integrate them into our medical model, we're going to get better outcomes for our patients with diabetes.
Dr. Leonard Egeda, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us today. I really appreciate all I've learned from your paper and our discussion about the role that these interventions based on monetary rewards can really lead to improved health outcomes and how they can be implemented in our own practices and communities. And delighted to hear all the ongoing work and evidence that your group and I'm sure many others are collecting right now to support this approach for the equitable care of our patients going forward. I encourage our listeners to access the full article in the March issue of Diabetes Care.
One of the feature articles from the March 2025 issue of Diabetes Care is a fascinating systematic review and meta-analysis entitled Comparative Efficacy of GLP-1 Receptor Agonists for Cardiovascular Outcomes in Asian versus White Persons by Dr. Matthew Lee and colleagues. I'm joined today by the first author, Dr. Matthew Lee, Cardiology Clinical Senior Lecturer and Honorary Consultant Cardiologist at the University of Glasgow, along with one of the senior authors, Professor Naveed Sattar, Professor of Cardiometabolic Medicine and Honorary Consultant at the University of Glasgow. Thank you very much, Matt and Naveed, for agreeing to be part of this podcast, and congratulations to you and your colleagues.
Thank you, Alice. I think, Matt, you and I were really happy to discuss this, and it was a collaborative effort, Matt, wasn't it? And, we enjoyed doing it.
Absolutely, yeah. Really grateful for the opportunity to collaborate with yourself, Naveed, my mentor, and our co-authors from around the world as well, actually. So very much a collaborative effort, and we're very excited to share our findings.
Fantastic. Thanks so much for doing this. So let's dive in. So prior to conducting this analysis, the CV benefits of GLP-1 receptor agonists were already well established in a broad population. So then what was the inspiration to do this particular analysis and look at the Asian population?
That's a fantastic question. Thank you. So while GLP-1 receptor agonists reduce major adverse cardiovascular events across diverse groups, cardiovascular risk varies by ethnicity. We've seen from numerous epidemiological studies that Asians face a higher risk of type 2 diabetes and atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease than other racial groups, even with the similar risk factors. So we wanted to really ask the question and determine if GLP-1 receptor agonists provide greater relative or absolute benefits in Asians compared with whites.
Yeah, so if I pick up on that, Alice, I guess the key motivation, as we all know, there is a historical underrepresentation of Asian individuals in cardiovascular outcome trials. And despite actually this population now contributing almost 60% of the global population, Asians often account for less than 10% of trial participants. So we also had a prior meta-analysis published in Diabetes Care, which did suggest that there may be greater MACE benefits in Asians compared with whites, but it was borderline significant. And now we had the opportunity to update that with the inclusion of Amplitude-O, as well as Select, which is a really quite sizable study, and perform a more rigorous and hopefully comprehensive analysis quantifying both relative and absolute benefits.
So how was this analysis performed? And Naveed, you started to answer this a bit. What is different and unique about this one compared to the others that have come before?
Well, I'll let Matt pick that up initially.
Okay, yeah, so this was a systematic review and meta-analysis focusing on large, randomized, placebo-controlled cardiovascular outcome trials of GLP-1 receptor agonists that reported ethnicity-specific hazard ratios for MACE outcomes in both Asian and white populations. From a statistical perspective, we used a random effects meta-analysis model, and we also, in this analysis, calculated absolute risk reduction and the number needed to treat.
Yeah, and I think specifically to your point, Alice, I guess unlike the prior meta-analysis, and as Matt's already said, we focus both on relative and absolute risk reductions. And the latter then, of course, allows you to work out numbers needed to treat, really to give us some sort of clinically meaningful insights. And, prior studies did hint at racial differences, but they didn't really quantify them in a clinically meaningful way. And, hats off to one of our co-authors, Dr. Dan McGuire, who's well known to many in the community, who basically, encouraged us to look also at absolute risk reduction, which we did.
Excellent. And we thank him for that. So what did you find?
So our headline findings, GLP-1 receptor agonists led to a greater reduction in both the relative and the absolute MACE risk in Asians compared to whites. The pooled hazard ratio for MACE was 0.69 in Asians versus 0.85 in whites. And the absolute risk reduction was 2.9% versus 1.4%. translating to a number needed to treat of 35 versus 73, respectively. So this suggests an approximately twofold greater relative hazard ratio reduction and also approximately twofold greater absolute risk reduction in Asians compared to whites.
And I guess these findings, they tell us two things. One, that GLP-1s are working at least as well in Asians as they are in whites, and potentially better, and may offer greater reductions in MACE. And that, that's got lots of potential implications for clinical decision making, particularly in high-risk individuals, and as we'll discuss later on, potentially for future trials as well.
Now, those are really interesting results. And as an Asian, I'm just going to say yay, because I think selfishly as an Asian, that sounds like the effects are greater. This, of course, begs the question of why, right? What are the hypotheses to explain this differential effect?
Yeah, and actually, you're talking to two other Asians. I mean, I'm obviously from South Asia, Matt's from Malaysia, so we'll come on to that. But actually, we had a discussion about this. Matt and I had a long discussion, and also with Darren and various other colleagues. I think several factors may contribute. So Asians on average, like the three of us, we're kind of relatively smaller body size, meaning perhaps the relative dose per body weight is higher. Maybe that's one explanation. And, there is evidence that, for example, from the Amplitude-O trial, that higher doses of epiglenitide compared to lower dose provided greater MACE benefit. So there may well be a dose response aspect. The other possibility is that as Asians are not really always forthcoming to come into trials, that the group of people, that Asians who came into the trial maybe had greater motivation and better sort of medication concordance than perhaps the white participants. And that's kind of what we see in studies in the UK. And a third possibility, and this is maybe stretching it a little bit, but just intuitively, if you think about Asians, we generally do get more diabetes. We generally have more ectopic fat for the same BMI and all the metabolic consequences. And perhaps the way that GLPs work on both weight and glycemia and ectopic fat, perhaps they're weighting to the factors that lead to risk being greater in Asians leads to a greater relative benefit in MACE. Now, that's very speculative, but, those are the things we came across. Matt, you might want to pick up some other things there as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Naveed. Yeah, and perhaps the baseline cardiovascular risks, again, is another factor, as from the initial kind of rationale, we've seen that Asians often have a higher inherent risk of atherosclerotic cardiovascular risk. So perhaps the absolute benefit to gain, given that higher baseline risk, is amplified with GLP-1 receptor agonists.
Now, as with everything, there are limitations, including to this particular analysis, and you provide an excellent discussion of that within the paper. But the one that I want to pick up on is what we've alluded to already, is the definition of Asian. I mean, the three of us chatting now would be categorized as Asians, but I would think that the biology of us would, in fact, be different. So is it appropriate to sort of lump it together as Asian, given that it represents a huge population and a huge geographical mass? And what are your thoughts on how this has been done thus far?
Yeah, this is obviously very topical in many respects, geopolitical as well. But it's a great point, Alice. I mean, Asian is a very broad category. 60% of the world's population are now Asian, including
Right.
East Asians, South Asians, Southeast Asians. And we all have unique genetic, dietary, and lifestyle factors that influences our CV risk and treatment response. And actually, most CVOTs don't stratify these subgroups, which is crazy. Absolutely crazy. It's limiting our ability to conduct more granular analysis. It means that actually we don't have the data that we need to understand what's causing disease in each of these subgroups and best target them as well. So that's really something we need to address. And again, Matt, you've thought about this as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So just to follow on from the feed there, so certainly we know future trials should really differentiate between these Asian subpopulations, and some of the subgroup data that exist are often underpowered. So it really highlights an important area for the future research.
And just to add to that, do you think in future research there needs to be further defining, because I'm thinking, for example, I'm of Chinese origin, but then someone of Chinese origin here in Canada participating in a clinical trial versus someone of Chinese origin participating in a clinical trial in China, is there a need to try to further categorize that, at least in the collection of the data, and then, analyses could then be done accordingly?
Yeah, I would say so, Alice. I think, clearly the fact that you have moved to Canada, your family moved to Canada, you have a certain phenotype as well, beyond just your ethnic origins, and different levels of agency, different dietary exposures, and all these things. So there's some kind of interaction going on. Absolutely. The more we are able to do that, obviously not overburdening people to give further characterization if they wish, but absolutely, the more we know. I mean, clearly the FDA's mandate of what Asian in clinical trials has to change. It has to be much better, much more granular going forward. We can no longer put 60% of the world's population into one category. It just doesn't make any sense. And, what I don't know, I know why South Asians get more diabetes. I don't know that about the Chinese. I don't know that about Japanese. I don't know that about Southeast other Asians. And we need those research areas to look at that. And we need to know whether the trials give us the same results for different interventions or not. That's absolutely something we need to think about.
So that leads perfectly into my next question. So where do we go from here? You've already sort of thrown out some things that we need to change, but what are the next steps in terms of research into this area, and how do we dive deeper?
So yeah, I think mechanistic studies, perhaps looking at pharmacogenomics and metabolic differences, would be important. And of course, our meta-analysis was actually a trial level based kind of meta-analysis. So individual participant meta-analysis would provide more insights and help clarify why the efficacy varies by ethnicity or race.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So two other things, and I think Matt's completely correct. Future trials should try to also ensure broader racial and ethnic diversity with more, as we've already said, Alice, more detailed racial categorization. That's something Matt had already thought about even before you asked those questions, and we all three of us agree. Being Asian, of different types of Asians. I mean, our results, let's step back, they're not 100% definitive, but they're very suggestive. But there'll be more trials coming on board, and we can add even more data going forward. But I think categorically the drugs work at least as well as in Asians, and potentially better. And if they do work potentially better, that might encourage more incretin-based trials in Asians or South Asians per se. Areas where diabetes and ASAVD are starting to climb absolutely rapidly. The biggest needs in future diabetes care, in terms of global, is actually in parts of Asia. China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, skyrocketing diabetes, rising atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease. And those are the areas where we need the trials. And our results, as they are, should encourage companies to think about, wait a second, these are groups at high risk. Maybe we should put some of our investments to do outcome trials in those parts of the world as well.
Fantastic. Such a great time having a conversation with you guys. So thank you very much, Dr. Matthew Lee and Professor Naveed Sattar, for sharing your expertise with us today. And huge congratulations to you and your colleagues for this fascinating meta-analysis that really gives us a lot of food for thought. Although on the one hand, generalizing results to say that everyone will benefit may allow us to use something in everyone and maybe make implementation a little bit easier if we sort of simplify things. But the reality is that some groups or individuals may in fact benefit more than others. And I think a better understanding of that can help us be more precise when we're having that shared decision-making conversation with patients. So research like this is very much needed. So thank you. And I want to encourage our listeners to read the full article in the March issue of Diabetes Care. Let's move on now to our rapid exchange segment, where Mike and I will chat about some of the articles we found particularly interesting this month. Mike, what is your first pick?
Alice, my first pick examines the prevalence of diagnosed diabetes among non-institutionalized adults living with disabilities in the United States. Dr. Barbara Bardenheyer and colleagues from the Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta, Georgia, analyzed data from the 2021 to 2022 National Health Interview Survey and found that adults living with any level of disability have higher diabetes prevalence than those without disability. And diabetes prevalence increases with both severity and number of disability types. These findings present a case for implementing tailored diabetes prevention programs for those with moderate to severe or multiple disability types.
And thanks so much for sharing that one with us, Mike. I think it's so important that we be aware of all the things that, I don't know if risk factor is quite the right word, but I guess rather associations with diabetes development so that we can try to tailor programs as best possible. So thank you for sharing that one with us. My first pick is a bit of a 2-for-1, so please forgive me. Dr. Lan Shu and colleagues from the Shanghai Jiaotong University School of Medicine looked at the incidence of young adult onset type 2 diabetes in the cross-sectional National Health Interview Survey from 2016 to 2022. This was defined as onset of diabetes at age 44 or less. The estimated incidence was 3 per 1,000 adults, with higher incidence noted in those from minority groups, socioeconomically disadvantaged individuals, and people with cardiometabolic disease or psychological conditions. Use of lipid-lowering medications, antihypertensive medications, as well as the presence of obesity, defined as a BMI of 30 plus, were the strongest risk factors for young adult onset type 2 diabetes. Now, this may help us better target prevention strategies to specific groups, and I think prevention is particularly important because younger age of onset is associated with worse outcomes. In the same issue, Dr. Sunjeon Kim and colleagues from the Seoul St. Mary's Hospital and Catholic University of Korea looked at the Korean National Health Insurance Service National Sample Cohort Database and found that people with youth onset diabetes, whether it be type 1 or type 2 diabetes, defined as onset at age 30 or younger, had much higher incidence rates of myocardial infarction, stroke, kidney failure, and all-cause mortality compared with the general population. So the risks are very real, and being able to better identify those at risk and intervening earlier to prevent the onset of diabetes is certainly worthwhile.
Thanks, Alice. Those papers do collectively add emphasis to the importance of diabetes prevention strategies for both type 2 as well as now type 1 diabetes that by at least delaying clinical diabetes by a number of years may result in longer-term health benefits. Turning to complications, SGLT2 inhibitor therapy comes with benefits for reducing progression of kidney disease and heart failure among individuals with type 2 diabetes, but also some risks. Ms. Catherine Griffin from the Tennessee Valley Healthcare System in Nashville and colleagues from Vanderbilt University Medical Center evaluated the risk for peripheral artery disease events, including revascularization and amputation procedures, among approximately 76,000 veterans prescribed an SGLT2 inhibitor compared to approximately 76,000 veterans prescribed a DPP4 inhibitor. After adjusting for indication by, for example, the presence of heart failure at the time of new drug initiation, the hazard ratio for experiencing a peripheral artery disease event was 1.18 for SGLT2 inhibitor use relative to DPP4 inhibitor use. While this absolute risk is low relative to the benefits described for SGLT2 inhibitors, it would certainly be nice if we could better identify those at greatest risk to experience one of these adverse events and who might be offered alternative therapies.
And I love the fact that you really highlighted the powerful benefits that SGLT2 inhibitors can bring. So then it's always a matter of putting potential risks in light of the potential benefits. And I think given the randomized control trial data around SGLT2 inhibitors and really that signal only coming from one of the studies does give us comfort, but really highlighted that we need to be taking care of feet. And I think that was an important good thing that came out of all of that question around amputations and SGLT2 inhibitors is that reminder that we absolutely need to be telling people to take care of their feet, to be examining their feet, and for us to be proactive with proper foot care. My second pick fits into, again, the concept of subtyping and categorizing to better assess risk as well as prognosis. Dr. Meredith Osmulski and colleagues from Northwestern University and other centers across the United States and Canada address the hypothesis that gestational diabetes subtypes are differentially associated with newborn and child anthropometric and glycemic outcomes. They looked at participants of the hyperglycemia and adverse pregnancy outcome, or also known as HAPO study, and the follow-up study. They classified the GDM into one of 3 subtypes. Insulin-deficient GDM, defined as someone with insulin secretion less than 25th percentile with preserved insulin sensitivity, or insulin-resistant GDM, defined as insulin sensitivity less than 25th percentile with preserved insulin secretion, or mixed defect GDM, where both insulin secretion and sensitivity were less than 25th percentile. Newborn and child outcomes were examined in 7,970 and 4,160 mother-offspring dyads. Compared with mothers with normal glucose tolerance, all three GDM subtypes were associated with higher birth weight and sum of skin folds greater than the 90th percentile. The insulin-resistant and mixed defect GDM subtypes were associated with higher risk of cord C-peptide greater than 90th percentile, and for childhood outcomes, like a higher risk of impaired glucose tolerance as a child. In addition, insulin-resistant GDM was also associated with higher risk of neonatal hypoglycemia and childhood obesity. Now, given the differential newborn and childhood outcomes for the different subtypes of GDM, perhaps better characterization will allow for more targeted, again, preventative intervention early in life.
And we saw something similar, Alice, with the recent study covered in our last October podcast episode, where among women with pregestational type 1 diabetes, preconception body mass index and maternal weight gain during pregnancy had independent effects on perinatal complications. So here in gestational diabetes, we also see there is more to worry about than just glucose control for women with diabetes during pregnancy in order to optimize delivery and neonatal outcomes. Turning now to type 1 diabetes, the results of the INHALE-3 study we discussed during our live podcast episode at the American Diabetes Association Scientific Sessions in June are now published. Dr. Earl Hirsch from the University of Washington in Seattle and colleagues evaluated a regimen of inhaled Technosphere insulin plus insulin degludec against usual care that for this study was split evenly between those who used automated insulin delivery and multiple daily injections. 62 adults with type 1 diabetes were randomized to the Technosphere insulin group and 61 to usual care and followed for 17 weeks. The trial met its endpoint of non-inferiority of the Technosphere insulin regimen, but interestingly, 21% in the Technosphere insulin group improved their hemoglobin A1C by greater than 0.5 percentage points, and 26% worsened their hemoglobin A1C also by greater than 0.5 percentage points. So it appears 1 in 5 individuals may really stand to benefit from trying this approach to insulin delivery. And next steps should focus on how to better figure out who those individuals are.
And I guess all of this is about having options and having choices, right? Because different people may require different strategies in order to fit into their particular lifestyle. And that's where perhaps inhaled insulin may have a role. So it'll be interesting to see how this field develops. Now, my last pick is also actually about predicting the future, which is kind of the stuff that we'd been talking about with some of the prior picks. So Dr. Marko Berovic from the Technische Universität Dresden in Germany and colleagues sought to identify potential biomarkers related to prediabetes trajectories by comparing the proteomic and metabolomic profiles of people with prediabetes progressing to diabetes or reversing to normal glycemia within 1 year. They looked at fasting plasma levels of 1,389 proteins and the fasting 30 minutes and 120-minute post-OGTT plasma levels of 152 metabolites in 108 participants who had prediabetes. Higher levels of dicarbonyl L-xylulose reductase and glutathione S-transferase A3 in the pre-diabetic state were associated with an increased risk of diabetes 1 year later. Other compounds were noted to be increased in new-onset diabetes compared with normal glycemia, which correlated with indices of insulin sensitivity. Pathway analysis pointed towards differences in immune response between diabetes and normal glycemia that were already recognizable in the pre-diabetic state 1 year prior. Now, these findings may help us predict who will progress and who will not, which can then really inform our interventions, again, with the focus on prevention.
That does bring us full circle, Alice, on the power of prevention, a crucial lesson for all of us to keep top of mind. Well, this brings us to the end of the March 2025 episode of Diabetes Care on Air. Thank you to Dr. Matthew Lee, Professor Naveed Sattar, and Dr. Leonard Egeda for sharing their expertise with us, and congratulations again for their featured articles.
And a big thank you to you, our listeners, for listening. Remember that Diabetes Care is continuing to take submissions of original art for consideration to be included on a future journal cover. Don't forget to subscribe to get notifications about new episodes of this podcast. Thank you for listening.